Alright, I told myself that if this goes over 10 minutes that I would just not even edit it because I'm just too lazy. I'm sure you've recently heard probably a lot the term elevated horror. It's a relatively new term used by movie nerds. Let me rephrase that because I would consider myself a movie nerd. Movie hipsters who are attempting to detach themselves from the rest of the horror community. They consider themselves more educated when it comes to films, particularly horror and thriller movies. They probably feel that movies that do not have a deep message or do not have the message pretty much on in your face are not considered elevated or smart or intelligent enough. Maybe things are not using lighting in an artistic way in their eyes, or they consider themselves to have more taste because they're not into the typical slasher or maybe are not interested into torture. These are subgenres that are simply beneath them. However, the idea of elevated horror is not a real subgenre, and I'm just going to briefly explain it because, again, I don't really like video essays. It's not that I don't like them. I'm honestly just lazy. I mean, if you look at my videos, my reviews are like 3 minutes on average. Believing elevated horror is an actual subgenre and the idea only applies to a niche amount of films implies that other movies or other movies in the horror genre are mediocre. It is calling them maybe not as intelligent or just stupid in general, and undermines the efforts that thousands of people put into making these movies, directing them, writing them, starring in them, or just sharing the ideas. According to Collider, the elements that are considered to be part of elevated horror are things that have already been put into movies for years, decades, almost a century. It features artsy cinematography. You have Hitchcock, Kubrick, Walton, Craven, all delivering this for the horror community well before elevated horror was even an idea. Collider says it's dark storytelling, which, what does that mean to you? That is clearly subjective because we could argue that grim and dark storytelling has always been a thing since stories have been made and have always existed in films. Dark sets and moody lighting doesn't make your movie good, nor does it make it intelligent or artsy. Another very important element that people consider to be the basis of elevated horror is that a social commentary is presented, or it touches on a very serious issue. Yeah, because no other movie can do that. Also, this idea that it relies heavily on metaphors and it requires the viewer to think. Social commentary does not make a film more artsy or more elevated than the next. 2020's Candyman, although directed very well by Nia DaCosta, tried really hard to push this message and ended up losing its story, but it is considered elevated horror. Is it really? Also, movies have always been created to get people to think in some capacity, presenting ideas, pushing a message, an opinion, sometimes religious views. 1992's Candyman, which is considered a slasher by the way, still had a narrative, presented a commentary at the same time, also the privileges of this white woman, Helen, while exploring or journeying, venturing through this black community without having an issue. Based off what many articles and people would define as elevated horror, Candyman doesn't fit, or at least 1992's Candyman does not fit under that. J. Gideon Sarantino states that elevated horror means something that is more intelligent or complex involved, which honestly broadens what the subgenre would be. Scream, another slasher that would also probably not be considered elevated horror, presents a commentary on the horror genre, is very self-aware, is meta, pokes at the tropes of horror movies, speaks on a commentary of the people that make the movie as well as the audience that loves the horror genre and is part of the community. And I think just because it touches on something that is considered serious, it becomes elevated. Mother, for example. It is on numerous lists of films that are considered elevated, but it's really just an interpretation of the Bible, of the religion of Christianity or Catholicism, and the director's opinions on the religion. It is a movie that I really like and I think is good, but it is not as subtle or as self-aware as the 1997 Scream. Green Room is another movie that has been on a couple lists of elevated horror, but I will say it is not a horror film, it is a thriller. A lot of people seem to not know the difference, including people in the industry, but that's for another conversation. The idea of elevated horror, or the term, seems to have come about in the 2010s when A24 was releasing a bunch of horror films that were getting a critical acclaim or positive reviews. So then it became a term used, especially with people that are in love with the A24 brand. And I do not necessarily have an issue with A24, more so with the fan base that rides really hard for them, considering that a lot of what has A24's name on it was not produced by A24, it's just distributed by them. A lot of times they just buy rights to films at film festivals that won awards, and just like other studios do. The idea that a movie must have a deep message, be deep, or touch on a serious topic devalues, in some respects, other films. And I would argue that it minimizes the efforts of many other filmmakers. I mean, you're saying that something like After Hours or Friday are not elevated or worth of that appraisal as another film maybe that touches on something more serious, such as maybe Get Out. This also dilutes the genre. This skewed idea of trying to fit into this fictional subgenre of elevated horror also has led to a lot of people sacrificing story completely for the sake of the message. I would even say bigger directors such as Jordan Peele would have done that with the movie Nope. I really enjoyed Nope, but I would say without the message, a lot of the story does not really make sense. Then you have movies like Men, 2020's Candyman, or even Smile. I go to a few film festivals and we have many aspiring filmmakers who immediately jump into the horror genre when they don't really make horror films, or they're trying to now because that's the big thing, that's what's popular. And in addition to that, they're trying to fit into the category of elevated horror instead of just a regular horror movie, or just a thriller, which again is not horror. I agree with filmmaker Cherry Rivera, who says that the term detracts from genre-bending movies that have existed almost a century before the idea of elevated horror existed, before A24 even existed or was even an idea. Frankenstein, Rosemary's Baby, Night of the Living Dead, all existing and elevating the genre before A24 or elevated horror was a twinkle in someone's eye. In some cases, it feels like an insult to filmmakers. In other cases, it seems a bit redundant. And a lot of these movies that you have in this list of elevated horror are just providing a message, but are not good films. Until next time, y'all take care of each other, check up on one another, make sure you check up on yourself, and remember, potential has no limit.